A chilling story unfolded in a quiet suburban area. There were threats, warnings, strange behavior, and moments of anxious tension. The crime was so brutal and calculated that it shocked even the most experienced investigators. The case was so complex that it hit a dead end several times. The terrible consequences of this tragedy will leave indelible marks. Marriage is a union that carries profound consequences not only for the couple, but also for their families and communities. When people get married, what starts as a promising journey can easily devolve into a tragic scenario worthy of crime headlines. On the fateful morning of November 27, 2017, the sheriff's office in Coffee County, Alabama, received a deeply unsettling report. A witness had come forward with information about what appeared to be a suicide. Police were dispatched to a residence owned by a local church, a house that had long been used by the community, but was now being rented out to congregation members. Living there was Sarah Starr, a recently divorced mother of 4 young children. Sarah Starr was born in 1979 in the small, humble town of Colby, Kansas. From a very young age, Sarah exhibited a natural affinity for understanding people, especially children. Her ability to connect with them led her to pursue a career in education, specifically teaching literature and writing at a local elementary school. After completing her degree at the University of Kansas, Sarah embarked on her teaching career. Her passion for literature was evident to her students, and those who interacted with her were quick to notice her empathy and gentle nature. People who knew her described her as not only a caring teacher, but also a person whose calm demeanor brought out the best in others, be it in the classroom or in more personal settings. Her life seemed poised for contentment, but as we will see, circumstances can shift dramatically. Sarah had married Jason in February 2001, when she was 22, and Jason was 28. At the time, Sarah had just finished her studies and had obtained her degree in education. Jason, a military veteran, had recently returned to civilian life and was trying to find his footing in the working world. His courtship was short-lived. Sarah, enchanted by Jason's strength and charm, thought she had found a partner for life. Jason, on the other hand, had already been through one failed marriage, from which he had a son. Despite his past, Sarah was determined to make their marriage work, confident that love could overcome any challenges they might face. For a few years, things seemed relatively stable. Jason found work, and Sarah supported him emotionally, focusing on building a home and family. Yet as time went on, cracks began to show in their relationship, cracks that would only deepen with the arrival of their children. 4 years into their marriage, Sarah and Jason welcomed twins. While Sarah was overjoyed, Jason's reaction was more muted. He struggled with the responsibilities of fatherhood, and as the couple's financial pressures mounted, his patience wore thin. A second set of twins was born 5 years later, adding even more strain to an already struggling household. For Sarah, however, becoming a mother of 4 was the fulfillment of a lifelong dream. She adored her children and threw herself wholeheartedly into motherhood. Jason, on the other hand, became more distant and irritable. Their marriage was deteriorating, but Sarah, ever the optimist, tried to hold things together for the sake of her children. They relocated to Coffee County, Alabama, in hopes that a change of scenery might improve their fortunes. Jason started a new job and even ventured into starting his own business, while Sarah took on the role of a full-time housewife, managing the household and caring for 4 young children. Despite her love for her family, Sarah found the responsibilities overwhelming. The demands of raising 4 children, maintaining the home, and trying to manage a part-time job left her physically and emotionally drained. Jason's new business was not doing as well as they had hoped, and his mood swings became more volatile. Publicly, he was dismissive and often cruel, belittling Sarah in front of others. In private, the emotional abuse worsened. Sarah's friends began to notice the toll this was taking on her, though she tried to downplay her struggles, insisting that things would get better. But it was becoming increasingly clear that their marriage was not what it appeared to be. In time, Sarah found solace in the local Baptist church, quickly becoming an integral part of the congregation. Her kind-heartedness, sociability, and infectious sense of humor made her a beloved member of the congregation. She also had hobbies such as gardening and photography, which brought her moments of peace amidst the turbulence of her personal life. By 2016, Sarah was teaching 4th grade at a local elementary school, where her colleagues spoke highly of her. They described her as upbeat and cheerful, a positive presence in the school. Despite her outward cheer, Sarah's home life remained a constant source of stress and sorrow. Jason often berated Sarah for the chaos that naturally comes with raising 4 young children. The noise, the mess, and the demands of parenthood seemed to wear on him, particularly after the birth of their second set of twins. The family had grown larger, but instead of viewing the children as blessings, Jason began to resent them, seeing them as a heavy burden rather than an extension of their love. This shift in his attitude worsened the already toxic environment in their home. Sarah realized that the relationship was no longer sustainable, but like many trapped in unhealthy marriages, she felt there was no way out. Financially, she had been dependent on Jason for years, and with 4 children to support, the idea of leaving seemed daunting. However, as soon as she secured her teaching position, Sarah saw a glimmer of hope for financial independence. The strength to leave Jason grew in her, and she began to envision a life without his constant emotional abuse. Even though she knew the road ahead would be difficult, what with dividing their property, sharing custody of the children, and untangling their financial ties, Sarah felt that the time had come to escape. She moved out of their home, renting a small house provided by the church, and filed for divorce. What followed was a grueling 2-year legal battle that took a toll on her mental health and emotional well-being. During the divorce process, Jason was relentless in his criticisms of Sarah. According to him, she was constantly under stress, and one of his chief complaints was her so-called frivolous spending. He accused Sarah of being a shopaholic, spending his hard-earned money on unnecessary items. Sarah did indeed face financial difficulties after separating from Jason, but this was largely because she had been left to support her children with minimal resources. Thankfully, the church community rallied around her during these tough times, offering her emotional and financial support. Despite everything, Sarah remained a loving and attentive mother. Her dedication to her children never wavered, and she managed to juggle her parental responsibilities while maintaining her job as a teacher. Still, the pressures of life weighed heavily on Sarah. Her mental health was deteriorating, and she found herself more and more anxious. She often quarreled with Jason during their encounters, struggled with insomnia, and showed signs of mild depression. Yet despite her fragile state, she refused to seek professional help, preferring to rely on antidepressants rather than engaging with a therapist. Her decision to avoid therapy reflected her deep-seated fear of vulnerability, perhaps a lasting effect of the emotional abuse she had endured during her marriage. When it finally came time to move out of the house she had shared with Jason, Sarah enlisted the help of her close friends Dana and Lawrence. They noticed that she was unusually nervous throughout the process. Sarah seemed frantic, rushing to pack her belongings, often forgetting things and having to return to the house multiple times. It was clear to Dana and Lawrence that something was deeply unsettling her. The most alarming part of the day was Sarah's constant fear that Jason might show up unannounced. She expressed a genuine terror of seeing him again, as if she expected some kind of confrontation. As it turned out, Jason did arrive, though not at the house they were vacating, but at Sarah's new place. When he appeared, Sarah bolted inside, clearly shaken by his presence. Lawrence, acting as a protective barrier, met Jason at the doorstep and asked him to leave. To their relief, Jason complied, though he lingered for a while before finally departing. Inside, Sarah was trembling, on the verge of a breakdown. She confided in Dana and Lawrence that she was convinced Jason had come to harm her. His previous threats to hurt her if she ever left him echoed in her mind, and this fear had been consuming her since the separation. Even after Jason had gone, Sarah remained on edge, her hands shaking, her voice unsteady. It took hours for her to calm down. This unsettling encounter occurred early in the separation, but the fear it instilled in Sarah lingered for years. Finally, after 2 agonizing years, the divorce was settled. According to the terms of the agreement, The custody of the children was divided between Sarah and Jason, with each parent responsible for two of the twins. Jason was also required to pay Sarah $3,500 a month in child support and spousal maintenance. This amount, while vital to Sarah's ability to care for her children, significantly impacted Jason's finances, as it represented more than half of his monthly income. Despite this, Sarah did not gain any rights to Jason's business or other assets. She continued to live in the modest house provided by the church, while Jason relocated to a nearby home, moving in with his elderly mother. Living just a short distance from Jason added to Sarah's ongoing anxiety. Even though the divorce was finalized, she never felt fully free of him. His presence, both physical and emotional, loomed large in her life. Every interaction they had, whether about the children, finances, or logistical arrangements, rekindled the fear and tension that had defined their marriage. For Sarah, the divorce had ended the legal ties between them, but the emotional wounds remained wide open. Despite the court's ruling, the shadow of Jason's anger and control continued to darken her new life, leaving her to wonder whether she would ever truly be free of him. On the morning of November 27, 2017, something tragic and unexpected unfolded that would change the lives of many people. Sarah Starr, a beloved teacher and devoted mother of 4, was supposed to return to work following the Thanksgiving holiday. Her colleagues, accustomed to her punctuality and dependability, became increasingly concerned when she didn't show up to her classroom. Attempts to reach her by phone went unanswered, and her absence was met with growing anxiety. It was completely out of character for Sarah to disappear without notifying anyone, particularly when it came to her responsibilities at the school. As the minutes ticked by, the staff's unease grew, and one of her colleagues, fearing something was terribly wrong, decided to check on her personally. Their worst fears were confirmed. Around 8:30 a.m., Sarah was found lying in a pool of blood in the driveway outside her home. The sight was horrifying and made their blood run cold. Emergency services were immediately called to the scene, but it was clear that her injuries were catastrophic. At first, some thought Sarah might have taken her own life, perhaps overwhelmed by the pressures of single motherhood and the trauma of her recent divorce. However, even a brief examination by the authorities indicated otherwise. It was clear that this was not a suicide. Sarah had been brutally attacked. The forensic examination revealed that Sarah had left her house at around 6:30 a.m., presumably on her way to work. But before she could even reach her car, she was gunned down. The assailant had used a shotgun, firing from nearly point-blank range. One shot struck her in the chest, while a second, devastating blast hit her in the head. The attack was vicious, cold-blooded, and clearly premeditated. Despite the severity of the crime, there were few immediate clues. The rural setting of Sarah's home meant that neighbors, though hearing gunshots, hadn't thought much of it. In such areas, it wasn't uncommon to hear gunfire, as people frequently used weapons for hunting or to scare off wildlife. As a result, the gunshots that killed Sarah were dismissed as part of the rural soundscape. There were no fingerprints, no tire tracks, and no witnesses who had seen the killer. The only thing investigators had to go on was Sarah's recent bitter divorce from her ex-husband, Jason Starr. Given the circumstances, Jason quickly became the prime suspect. Jason and Sarah's marriage had been troubled, with years of emotional abuse culminating in their divorce, which had only been finalized a few months before Sarah's death. Sarah had confided in close friends, including Dana and Lawrence, who had helped her move out of the house she shared with Jason. They confirmed to police that Sarah had been living in fear of her ex-husband, especially after the divorce settlement required Jason to pay substantial alimony and child support. Sarah had often expressed her belief that Jason might seek revenge, fearing that he would lash out due to the financial strain the divorce put on him. The proximity of Jason's new residence, just a few minutes' walk from Sarah's rented church house, only heightened suspicions. It seemed almost too coincidental that Sarah had been killed shortly after a contentious divorce, and with Jason living so close by, it was natural for investigators to consider him the most likely culprit. He was quickly brought in for questioning. Jason, however, denied any involvement in Sarah's murder. He told investigators that on the morning of the shooting, He had been at a local restaurant, eating breakfast with his children. To the disappointment of law enforcement, Jason's alibi was corroborated by security footage and witness testimony. After hours of interrogation, he was released, though detectives remained unconvinced of his innocence. Even if he hadn't pulled the trigger himself, they speculated that Jason might have orchestrated the attack. Perhaps he had hired someone to kill Sarah, motivated by the financial burden of the divorce and his ongoing resentment towards his ex-wife. These suspicions lingered, but without concrete evidence, the investigation hit a wall. Jason's release did little to quell the growing tension surrounding the case. Although his alibi seemed solid, those closest to Sarah remained convinced that he was somehow involved. After all, Sarah had no known enemies, no connections to the criminal underworld, and no history of dangerous associations. Her murder seemed personal, and the most obvious motive belonged to Jason. Yet proving his involvement was another matter entirely. Over the following months, the investigation dragged on with few developments. The local police, lacking significant leads, continued to keep a close watch on Jason, hoping that something would slip through the cracks. By January 2018, despite their efforts, no new evidence emerged. In an attempt to reignite public interest in the case, a press conference was held. The state governor announced a $5,000 reward for any information leading to the arrest of Sarah's killer. An additional $500 was later contributed by a concerned townsperson. Unfortunately, these efforts did not yield results. A handful of tips came in, but each one was investigated and ultimately dismissed as irrelevant. With the investigation stalled, Sarah's children were placed into the custody of social services. This decision was made due to lingering concerns about Jason's integrity and whether it was safe for the children to remain in his care. As a result, Jason's relationship with his children became increasingly strained, further complicating his life in the wake of the tragedy. As months turned into years, the case grew colder. Despite occasional statements from law enforcement and renewed appeals for information, Sarah's murder remained unsolved. Local police were joined by state law enforcement agencies in their efforts to find justice for Sarah, but every lead they pursued eventually fizzled out. By that point, public interest had waned, and the community had started to lose hope that Sarah's killer would ever be brought to justice. Yet, for Sarah's family, friends, and the many people whose lives she had touched, the memory of that horrific morning in 2017 remained painfully fresh. The question that haunted them all was simple. Would Sarah ever find the justice she deserved, or would her tragic death remain a mystery forever? It wasn't easy for the detectives to establish a clear connection between Jason Starr and his ex-wife's murder, but they were increasingly convinced that he was involved. Although Jason had a solid alibi for the morning of Sarah's death, he had been having breakfast with his children at a local restaurant. This didn't entirely absolve him of suspicion. The investigators theorized that if Jason didn't commit the crime himself, he might have hired someone to do it. Financial pressure provided a strong motive. After the divorce, Jason was ordered to pay over half of his income, $3,500 out of a $6,300 monthly salary, in alimony and child support. This situation was an obvious source of resentment for him. Jason had tried and failed to gain full custody of his children in order to avoid these payments, which only intensified his frustrations. It wasn't until December 2021, 4 long years after Sarah's death, that the investigation saw any renewed attention. While investigating Jason's personal life, police examined his computer and discovered a mass of documents that shed new light on his state of mind. The files appeared to be part of a draft for a book Jason had been writing for years. In these writings, he vented his anger over the court's decision, bitterly resenting the financial obligations imposed on him. His notes were filled with degrading comments about Sarah and women in general. The tone was aggressive and demeaning, and while there was no explicit mention of a plan to kill Sarah, his contempt for her was evident. The more detectives read, the clearer it became that Jason harbored a deep, festering hatred for his ex-wife. These writings only bolstered the investigators' suspicions. The investigation took a significant turn when detectives began scrutinizing Jason's financial transactions. They discovered a series of 7 payments totaling $2,600, all made between September 7th and November 15th, 2017. These transactions were sent to a woman named Lily, a person Jason had no known prior relationship with. The investigation revealed that Lily was a friend of Jason's brother, Darren. Curiously, before September 7th, there had been no contact or financial exchanges between Jason and Lily. This sudden flurry of payments raised red flags, leading the detectives to dig deeper into this connection. When the police interviewed Lily, they uncovered another peculiar detail. Jason had given his brother Darren a 2016 model motorcycle, an expensive gift that seemed out of place considering Jason's tight financial situation. When questioned about this, Jason claimed that the motorcycle had been damaged in an accident and that he hadn't wanted to go through the insurance process. Instead, he said, he gave the bike to Darren to repair. According to Jason, Darren had estimated the repairs would cost $5,000, and the $2,600 in payments was supposed to help cover the cost of the parts. However, the fact that Jason sent this money through Lily rather than directly to Darren seemed odd. Jason offered no explanation for why he chose to involve a woman he barely knew in this financial arrangement. The detectives weren't buying Jason's story. The use of Lily as an intermediary looked suspicious, as though Jason were trying to conceal the true nature of these transactions. While Jason maintained that the money was meant to help repair the motorcycle, the police believed it was more likely that these payments were part of a scheme to fund Sarah's murder. Darren or Lily, or both, might have been involved in the killing, with Lily acting as a front to throw investigators off the trail. This theory was bolstered by the discovery that Darren had been in Alabama, near Sarah's home, in the days leading up to her death. Darren was not an easy man to track down. Described as a loner with a rough personality, he lived a largely isolated life in a trailer in Texas. He had a history of minor criminal activity, including a 2013 arrest for drug possession. When Darren had been pulled over for speeding that year, a police dog had alerted the officers to drugs in the vehicle. A subsequent search revealed various narcotics and equipment for their manufacture. Although Darren's drug charges resulted in a relatively lenient sentence, his criminal record painted a picture of a man with a penchant for crime. The detectives now faced a critical question. Was Darren capable of murder? They began to look more closely at his relationship with Jason, examining text messages, phone records, and other communications. As they pieced together Darren's movements in the days leading up to Sarah's murder, they found disturbing evidence. On November 18, 2017, just days before Sarah was killed, Darren had arrived in Coffee County, Alabama. He stayed in the area for 10 days, during which time he was frequently seen near the house Sarah rented from the church. The most damning piece of evidence came from cell phone records. Darren's phone had been turned off for several hours on the night before the murder, a common tactic used to avoid being tracked. When his phone was finally switched back on, it was around 10 a.m. the next day, and Darren was already back in Texas. This timing aligned perfectly with the murder, as Sarah had been shot early in the morning, between 6:30 and 7 a.m. The fact that Darren had been in the vicinity of Sarah's home and had turned off his phone suggested that he had something to hide. It seemed increasingly likely that Darren had carried out the murder, possibly at Jason's behest. Investigators began to zero in on Darren as the primary suspect, though they still couldn't rule out the possibility that Jason had orchestrated the entire plot. Jason's financial struggles, his bitter writings about Sarah, and the suspicious money transfers all pointed to his involvement in some capacity. Darren's sudden appearance in Alabama, coupled with his evasive behavior, made him a prime suspect in Sarah's killing. But proving that either of them was directly responsible for her death would require more evidence. As the case continued to unfold, it became clear that this was not just a story of a bitter divorce gone wrong. It was a tale of greed, anger, and revenge, with both Jason and Darren playing key roles in a conspiracy that led to the brutal murder of a mother of 4. The detectives were determined to get to the bottom of it, but they knew that proving Jason and Darren's guilt would be a long and arduous process. On the evening of November 27, the same day Sarah was murdered, Darren sent his brother Jason a cryptic message. It read like a coded communication, referencing the success of a deer hunt. To the detectives, it became clear that the brothers were communicating in code to conceal their involvement in Sarah's murder. A neighbor had even reported seeing a motorcycle near Sarah's house multiple times in the days leading up to the crime. The description of the motorcycle matched one Darren owned, and others in the neighborhood had also noticed this vehicle, but no one thought much of it at the time. The final piece of evidence came from a surveillance camera attached to a barn near Sarah's house. Just minutes after the crime, the camera caught a glimpse of the same motorcycle speeding away from the scene. Based on this mounting evidence, the detectives concluded that Jason had hired his brother to kill Sarah. On December 1, 2021, both Jason and Darren were formally charged with the murder. Jason, when arrested, behaved arrogantly, demanding a lawyer and dismissing the charges with an air of confidence. He repeatedly denied any involvement, stating that the police had no case against him. Jason was later released on bail pending trial, with an ankle bracelet placed on his body to track his movements. His trial was scheduled for June 27, 2022. Darren's situation was far more complicated. Unlike his brother, Darren fled, and the FBI took charge of the manhunt. Darren was added to the federal wanted list, with his photo circulated nationwide. Authorities offered a $10,000 reward for information leading to his capture, which was later raised to $225,000, showing the seriousness of the case. After a 2-month-long manhunt, Darren finally surrendered to authorities in Texas on February 5, 2022. He maintained his innocence and refused to be placed under house arrest, opting instead to stay in prison while awaiting trial. Throughout this period, Darren and Jason continued communicating via phone, though their conversations were carefully monitored by law enforcement. Despite the wiretaps, neither brother said anything particularly incriminating. The lack of direct evidence against Darren led to delays in the case, as the prosecution struggled to build a solid case against him. Darren's defense team capitalized on this, arguing that the case relied too heavily on circumstantial evidence. During the pretrial phase, Darren's lawyer repeatedly attempted to shift suspicion away from the brothers by proposing alternative suspects. However, each of these leads was quickly debunked by the police, who found no evidence linking these individuals to the crime. Eventually, the court barred any further mention of these supposed suspects, citing a state law that prohibited the implication of third parties in a crime without strong evidence. By September 11, 2023, nearly 6 years after Sarah's murder, the trials for both Jason and Darren finally began. The prolonged delays had frustrated the community, which had been following the case closely. The prosecution's case rested heavily on Jason's financial motives. The state presented evidence that Jason had been struggling to meet the court-ordered alimony and child support payments, which amounted to more than half his monthly income. His resentment over these financial obligations, coupled with his animosity towards Sarah, created a compelling motive. The prosecution argued that Jason's bitterness toward his ex-wife had driven him to conspire with his brother Darren to eliminate her. They laid out the chain of events: Jason's transfer of money to Darren, his coded messages, and the suspicious use of Lily, a distant acquaintance, to funnel funds. They also noted that Darren had been in Alabama at the time of the murder and was seen near Sarah's home, tying him to the crime scene. The prosecutor's case was bolstered by the peculiar behavior of both Jason and Darren. Jason had sent money to Darren through Lily, despite having no ongoing relationship with her, and neither brother had communicated with her before or after the crime. This led prosecutors to argue that the brothers had used Lily as a conduit to hide their financial transactions. Though Lily was initially implicated as an accomplice, she was able to clear her name by insisting that she had no knowledge of the crime. She claimed she had simply facilitated the financial transfers without understanding their true purpose. Her shock at being considered a potential accomplice led the prosecutors to drop any charges against her. The defense, on the other hand, tried to poke holes in the prosecution's case. They argued that the police had rushed to judgment and had no solid evidence linking the brothers to Sarah's death. The defense team highlighted the absence of direct proof. The murder weapon was never found, there were no eyewitnesses to the crime, and the surveillance footage only showed a motorcycle driving away from the scene. It didn't capture the murder itself. Furthermore, Jason's bitter writings about Sarah, which the prosecution used as evidence of his intent, were framed by the defense as nothing more than emotional outbursts from a man struggling with the financial strain of a divorce. The defense argued that Jason's anger and frustration were not proof of a criminal conspiracy, but rather the natural reaction of someone overwhelmed by financial stress and personal loss. Moreover, the defense made a compelling case regarding the lack of forensic evidence. No DNA or physical evidence linked Darren directly to the scene of the crime. While Darren's presence in Alabama during the time of the murder was suspicious, the defense pointed out that there was no clear evidence proving he had actually committed the murder. Darren's lawyer painted him as a man with a troubled past, but far from a calculated killer. Yet the most significant argument from the defense was the challenge to the prosecution's timeline. The defense insisted that the authorities had made numerous procedural errors, including arresting Jason and Darren based on circumstantial evidence. They also highlighted that the motorcycle, which played a key role in the prosecution's case, was never found with any physical traces that connected it to the murder. Without more solid proof, the defense claimed, the entire case rested on conjecture. As the trial unfolded, the jury was left to grapple with these conflicting narratives. On one hand, there was the undeniable circumstantial evidence, Jason's financial despair, the cryptic messages between the brothers, and Darren's suspicious behavior leading up to the murder. On the other hand, the defense raised legitimate concerns about the lack of direct evidence, questioning whether the prosecution's case was built more on suspicion than facts. But there was one very interesting fact. During Darren's 10-day stay in Alabama, no recordings of telephone conversations between him and his brother Jason were found. This led investigators to believe that the two may have resorted to more discreet methods of communication, possibly face-to-face meetings or the use of disposable phones, which are often linked to illegal activities because of their untraceable nature. The defense lawyer pointed out that despite these suspicions, no solid forensic evidence was found at the crime scene to implicate the brothers. There were no footprints, fingerprints, DNA, or even tire tracks from the motorcycle. The absence of these crucial elements, according to the defense, was a strong argument that the prosecution's case lacked concrete proof. The lawyer also questioned the reliability of the surveillance footage. The video, captured by a camera on a barn near Sarah's house, was grainy and of poor quality. While it did show a motorcycle passing by a few minutes after the crime, it did not provide a clear enough image to conclusively identify the rider or the bike. The defense suggested that this footage could easily show someone else, pointing out that many people in the area owned motorcycles and frequently rode past that barn. Thus, the footage was far from definitive evidence. One of the defense's key arguments came from an alibi Jason provided. On the morning of Sarah's murder, Jason was seen having breakfast with his children at a restaurant about 10 miles from Sarah's home. This was around the time the crime occurred, which the defense argued made it highly unlikely that Jason could have been directly involved in the murder. Moreover, Jason had cooperated with the police from the outset, handing over his mobile phone and computer voluntarily. The lawyer stressed that a guilty person, especially one involved in planning a murder, would have been far more guarded and less willing to let the police examine such personal items. However, the prosecution countered these arguments by focusing on Jason's behavior following his arrest. And suddenly, unexpectedly for everyone, he finally confessed to organizing the murder of his ex-wife. This confession, though, had complicated the defense's narrative. It was difficult for the jury to reconcile the image of a cooperative man with that of someone who later admitted to planning a brutal killing. After 6 days of heated court debates, the jury was tasked with deliberating the verdict. Their deliberations lasted 6 hours, and ultimately, on January 4, 2024, both brothers were sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Jason, who had been under house arrest and required to wear an electronic bracelet, was taken into custody immediately after the sentencing.